He thought he was just another customer, but when he overheard the conversation behind him, everything changed. The bright overhead lights reflected off the gleaming vehicles in Hayes Auto Dealership, one of the most successful truck dealerships in the country. And its owner, James Hayes, was standing in the middle of it, completely unnoticed. Dressed in a simple flannel shirt, worn-out jeans, and work boots, James blended in perfectly with the crowd of everyday buyers. No one recognized him as the billionaire behind the company. And that's exactly what he wanted. For months, he had heard rumors, customers being misled, and hard-working people being denied fair deals, employees being pushed to meet quotas at any cost. So tonight, he had walked into his own dealership as an ordinary man to see the truth for himself. He ran a hand over the hood of a rugged black pickup, pretending to inspect it. Nearby, a salesman was already eyeing him, sizing him up. But before James could make his next move, a voice behind him made him freeze. A woman, her tone frustrated yet desperate. "Sir, please, I just need a reliable truck, something safe. I can't afford the high-end models, but I have enough for a decent used one." James turned slightly, pretending to adjust his jacket so he could listen without being noticed. A salesman, one of his employees, let out a sharp sigh. "Ma'am, I've already told you, the trucks in your price range aren't available. If you can't afford something newer, maybe this place isn't for you." James's stomach twisted. The woman hesitated, her hands tightening around her purse strap. "But I was told you had options." The salesman chuckled coldly. "Options? Not for people who can't pay up front." James's jaw clenched. He turned just enough to get a good look at her. She was young, mid-30s maybe, wearing work boots covered in dust and a faded mechanic's uniform. She wasn't just buying a truck. She needed one for her job. And yet, she was being turned away. Like she didn't matter. James had heard enough. His hand tightened into a fist, but he forced himself to stay calm. Not yet. Instead, he turned back to the salesman he'd been dealing with earlier and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I'll take this truck. Cash." The salesman's face lit up instantly. "Great choice, sir. Let's get you set up with the paperwork." But as James followed him toward the office, his gaze flicked back to the woman, because she had no idea that the man standing just a few feet away, the man she had just been humiliated in front of, was about to change everything. James followed the salesman toward the office, but his mind wasn't on the truck anymore. He couldn't shake what he had just heard. A hard-working woman being denied a fair deal, not because of her credit, not because she was unqualified, but simply because the salesman didn't think she was worth the effort. And in his dealership, unacceptable. He glanced over his shoulder. The woman stood frozen by the door, her hands clenched into fists. Her face was tight, like she was trying to hold back anger, or worse, disappointment. James had built this business on trust, fairness, and hard work. If his employees were treating customers like this when they thought no one important was watching, how many others had been turned away? His jaw tightened. Not today. The salesman led him into the glass-walled office, grinning. "So, sir, let's talk numbers. I can get you a great financing deal." James cut him off. Pulling a thick envelope from his jacket, he tossed it on the desk. "Cash," he said flatly. The salesman's eyes widened. "Oh, wow. We don't get a lot of cash buyers." James folded his arms. "Yeah? You don't get a lot of hardworking folks paying with what they have instead of taking on debt?" The salesman hesitated. "Well, some people just aren't the right fit for certain vehicles." James leaned forward. "Like the woman outside?" The salesman stiffened. "Sir, James held up a hand, his voice dangerously calm. "Tell me, was she really not qualified for financing, or was she just not worth your time?" The salesman swallowed hard. I just assumed she couldn't afford—" "That's your problem right there," James cut in, his tone sharp. "You assumed." The salesman paled. James pushed the envelope of cash toward him. "I'm buying a truck today, all right?" The salesman let out a nervous laugh. "Yes, of course. Which one are you taking?" James narrowed his eyes. "Hers." The salesman blinked. "What?" James smirked coldly. "The truck she was asking for, the one you told her wasn't available, that's the one I want." The salesman visibly panicked. But sir, James held up a finger. And when you hand me the keys? His smirk faded, replaced by something deadly serious. You're going to walk outside, apologize to that woman, and tell her she's getting the truck. On the house. The salesman froze. His mouth opened, but no words came out. James leaned in. You work for me. The salesman's face drained of color. Sir, I didn't know. James placed his hands on the desk and smiled. You do now. The salesman sat completely frozen, his face turning pale as realization hit him like a freight train. Mr. Hayes, he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know it was you. James leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. That's the point, isn't it? The salesman swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. Sir, I was just following standard procedure. We have guidelines on... James slammed his palm onto the desk, cutting him off. Standard procedure? His voice was dangerously low. Let me make something clear. In my company, no one, no matter how much or how little they have, is treated like they don't belong. The salesman opened his mouth to argue, but immediately thought better of it. James continued, his voice now controlled but icy. That woman walked in looking for a reliable truck to help her make a living, and instead of helping her, you embarrassed her. The salesman's eyes darted toward the glass walls of the office. Customers and employees had started to notice. A few workers exchanged nervous glances, pretending not to listen. James let the silence stretch, making sure every second burned into the man's memory. Then, finally, he grabbed the paperwork and started signing. She's getting the truck, he said firmly. Paid in full. I'll be handing her the keys myself. The salesman nodded frantically. Yes, sir. Of course, sir. James stood up slowly, fixing the man with one last cold stare. You should start cleaning out your desk, he said, voice calm but final. Because after tonight, you don't work here anymore. The salesman stiffened. Sir, please, I need this job. James shook his head. You had a job. You lost it the second you decided profits were more important than people. The man's shoulders slumped in defeat. He knew arguing was pointless. James didn't wait for another excuse. He grabbed the truck keys off the desk and walked straight out of the office. The dealership floor went dead silent as he approached the woman at the entrance. She was still standing there, arms crossed, clearly debating whether to leave. Her face held a mix of frustration and exhaustion. James stopped in front of her and held out the keys. She blinked. What? James smiled. Your truck is ready, ma'am, paid in full. Her breath hitched. I don't understand. Why? James held her gaze. Because people like you are the backbone of this country. And because no one deserves to be treated the way you just were. Tears filled her eyes. I don't know what to say. James chuckled. Then don't say anything. Just take the keys. Her hands trembled as she reached for them, gripping them like they were the most valuable thing in the world. Around them, employees whispered. Customers stared, but James didn't care. Because tonight, he had reminded everyone exactly what this company stood for. And as he watched the woman walk toward her brand new truck, eyes shining with disbelief, he knew he had made the right call.